First, I just want to say, loved the movie. It's really my kind of psychological slow burn, and it's so female forward that it really spoke to me, kind of on a fundamental level. The film feels very personal, both to me, and it feels as if it is stemming from a personal place. Is there anything that you were drawing from specifically, and anything that you felt that you were infusing into the story?
Completely, yeah. And I mean, that's what drew me to the script in the first place, and why I directed, something that I hadn't written, because while I'm always open to that, I typically write the films that I make. So, this was, when I read it, there was so much about it that felt familiar, that that was a big deciding factor in wanting to do it. And there's loads of things in it that are very personal. You're right. I think probably most significantly is what could be understood as Betsy's experience of disordered eating. So, I'm a person with anxiety and depression. I have a mood disorder. And at times that's manifested in ways where I've been very controlling around food and basically not eaten for 2 years. That's how that kind of played out. And so I acutely understood Betsy's attraction to being really good at this thing, like feeling like there was some kind of power or control taken by basically committing so completely to this cause. And I also understand that for Betsy, it gets to a point where it's not about not eating, it's about the bad thing that will happen if she does eat. And that's really, unfortunately, eating disorders don't always fall neatly into like categories. But if we're talking about anorexia, for example, it's not a fear of getting fat. It's a fear of what will happen if you eat the food. And it's much bigger than that. It's a mental illness. It's completely irrational. So I understood her commitment in that way, but I also understood the fallout with the family. And I know what it was for my mum to watch me not eat, and to basically be the person going, eat the fucking pea, and being the person going, I can't eat that pea. You don't understand. And so that was very, very familiar, that side of it. And also, I guess, then the ripples to the family unit, that sort of wave through the family unit. So how it kind of impacts detrimentally on Isabel. I don't have a younger sister, but I have a younger brother that was, that had to kind of navigate the relationship between me and my mom. And so all that stuff was just very gnarly and familiar. And also kind of that thread, the tragedy of what happens to Isabel as a result of Betsy's decision, or how Betsy deals with her grief, was one of the things that made me want to direct the movie. Isabel is kind of a very quiet character in it, but one that I was so drawn to. And kind of, her journey is kind of so horrible in itself. And then, there's also just the experience of mental health. It's kind of, I'm really curious about, the idea of belief. And, I'm not a religious person, so that wasn't how I tapped into Betsy's experience of having this faith, whatever faith is. For me, it was this kind of sense of believing so strongly in something, believing in an idea so strongly that other people couldn't see it. And I always say that's something I was the most frightened of as a kid, was the idea of not being believed. It was the source of great horror for me. Was like, what if my parents didn't believe me? And so that's, loads and loads of things about the script, really sung to me, but definitely those elements, and the dynamic of mother-daughter relationships, which I think is incredibly specific in relation to food and bodies.
Absolutely. In fact, it's so much of the resolution, if you can even call it a resolution at the end, seems to stem from a generational gap on how they dealt with mental illness, and who was or was not correct, and the way they handled it is kind of, I think, the way the viewer reads that ending.
Yeah.
Was there a specific, did you feel like the film should be read one way or another, or is it whatever speaks to the viewer?
It's whatever speaks to the viewer, but for me, I'm reading the script. I knew what I believed the ending was. I kind of had my own opinion about what the ending needed to mean. And for me, it was very much about Holly's journey being worth it. That, that Betsy were in some sense telling the truth. It needed, I basically, there's I'm being conscious of how I talk about it because I don't want to like spoil anything, I guess.
Right.
But, from Holly's perspective, you've got a kid that either, is lying and being manipulative, who believes something wholeheartedly, or who's not well mentally, so it's like that was the three lenses through which I kind of always looked at Betsy's character from Holly's perspective. And I think at the end, in a way, it doesn't really matter. It's just that it's over because it's
right.
such a tortuous, arduous kind of experience for them both. But I know, I know what I needed the ending to be in order to feel like it was a journey worth going on. And certainly the original script had it had a perspective on an apocalypse that was a bit more definitive, and I wanted to turn it into more of a kind of an inward experience where you don't really know what's happening to Sienna or Holly, at the end of the film.
Right. It reminded me a little bit of Starfish. I don't know if you saw that, or Babadook, in that it's a very internal look at what grief does to a family, and how it just almost, it is better to just be over whatever over looks like, however horrific that is. Is that kind of what you were feeling about things as well?
Yeah, the grief was obviously a huge catalyst for, this family's wound and kind of what is, I guess the tragedy of the family, for sure. I suppose if thinking about it with you asking me now, the loss and the grief is more of, it's more of like what starts off a different kind of journey. So, I'm not somebody who's experienced that kind of loss. I'm fortunate in that way. So that wasn't for me a kind of touchstone. What was this sort of powerful, perfect storm for Betsy of that happening at that point in her life, when she's on the cusp of kind of adulthood, when she feels voiceless, when she's, being asked to think about a future, and yet at the same time hyper aware that, the planet's burning and there's not a lot of point. And, and she's also being put upon by her mother to sort of maybe be more adult than she should at that point in her life. So it's all these things that come together that, like, push all the buttons at once to sort of set her on this path, whether she has a real epiphanous experience or is high on drugs, we don't know. But, there's something for her needs to change. And I think, there's, I suppose Holly doesn't have a lot of room to process her grief, while this is going on, so it's never to take away the great loss that the family experiences at the start, but I wouldn't say that the grief is as central as it is, say, in Babadook. I would say that is a film about grief. I would say this is a film about what people do with their grief, and somehow that means something different to me.
Right, absolutely. In speaking about their relationship, Holly and Betsy, and her mother June, and poor Isabel, who's stuck in the middle of all of this, it seems like a very serious power struggle between mother and daughter, which is a very common dynamic, with mothers and daughters. And it almost seems like the more that Betsy refuses to eat, the fancier, more meticulous, more almost obscene her fancy meals become, because it's almost like she's just trying to force feed her maternal nourishment to Betsy, and Betsy is trying desperately to I guess, really just get back her own control, to feel like she is growing up. And the push and the pull is just makes for me anyway, some of the most tense moments. Was that intentional?
Yes, I love that you've picked up. I love that that has been the experience for you, because for me that was the meat of the meat of the horror and the drama, and the script was just about these micro, passive aggressive moments between mothers and daughters. Like, and we all know that shit, even if you've got a really good relationship with your mum, it's like those bits were what felt the most authentic and true to me. And particularly the dinner table scene with the peas, and that that for me is the most probably dramatic moment in the whole film, is kind of like what it says for Holly to be pushing this and to be infantilizing her that way as well. And I mean, it's a really cool observation that the food may appear to get fancier. I think there's something in that of Holly going, look at the effort I'm making, look at it, look at what I've done, just eat it. How can she not refuse this when she's seen I've put this much effort in? But I also think, Holly is somebody who, is just a person who really cares about food and good food and nourishment, and kind of, that ritual of sitting around the table and providing for her children, and maybe, maybe making it extra nice because their dads just died relatively recently,
Right.
I think, we also Sienna and I talked about Holly being a person who who probably had a creative career. It never makes the screen, what her professional life may be, but like we talked about her maybe being a food photographer or a food stylist or something like that, because certainly her home reflects a kind of eye for design and an order and things looking pretty.
Well, and speaking of the home, it's so very odd and specific, and it almost doesn't seem like structurally possible the way that it was shot. How did you find this house? And is this what you were hoping for? Something that felt so claustrophobic and insulated?
So the honest answer is this, this house was a gift. We weren't looking for this house, but I knew that the house was, we needed to have a hero house that had personality, because it's where most of this film was set. And it needed to be a space that, while the film isn't really, really long, that an audience wouldn't get bored being inside. But the search for a house was really compromised because of COVID, because of when we shot, and the fact that there was just very limited pickings, basically. There was not a lot of choice. And so this house, when we saw it, it wasn't an immediately obvious choice, only because it had a limited amount of bedrooms. So it meant that the script had to change shape because of it. There was scenes that had to be adapted because basically there wasn't space for Holly's bedroom. So that kind of thing felt like a bit of a sacrifice at the time. But I think what really drew me to the space, apart from the obvious huge panoramic window onto this weird exotic garden in London, was this kind of amphitheater kind of like vibe. So the living area that connects where the sort of, I guess, the living room is, and where Holly ends up sleeping, to where they eat, is almost like, it's like an arena, it's like a stage. It's also like a kind of a version of an ice rink because of the stone floor. And I think that there was something about it, felt like we could watch the play of Dad dying on that stage at the beginning. And this is the stage for where this family's drama is going to unfold. And it's also a strange property in that it had about 4 or 5 exits. So you could come into it from so many different points, and that really fucks with people's heads when they're watching it, because people arrive, disappear. And I love that about it. That felt like a real, bonus feature of the location itself. And, the best thing about it was that we were able to, our budget was able just to cover changing the interior significantly, because that was a very white house. And so we made it the very opposite of that, because we wanted it to be a dark space. And again, it's, props to my production designer, Sophia Stockel, because we talked about minimalism. I wanted that control.
Mhm.
In the space. And I remember when we were doing prep, she sent me 3 folders of images, and one was minimalist, really minimalist, and really fucking minimalist. And it went from like, you know, pretty tidy space to like a twig in a vase. That was it. And I was like, I don't think we should go that far. I think that's extreme. People live here. And she was like, I think we should. And she pushed me, and I'm so glad she did, because it's, yeah, it feels like a strange family home setting, and yet it is their family home, and it works, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Tell me a little bit about the prosthetic and how the Japanese folklore factored into the decisions that you made with that.
Sure. Well, that's from Justin, the original, you know, the screenwriter. That was his folklore. He introduced me to that. And it's a great, you know, it's a great story, and it's a great story for June to tell. But when I researched it, you know, all associated imagery, which was obviously illustrative or graphic, was a very specific kind of a mouth. So it's this mouth on the back of a woman's head that's consuming food. And it had a very demonic look, a very sharp look. It was a horizontal mouth as well. And in some imagery, there was eyes. And I felt it was almost comical. I think that's not the kind of horror that jives with me. I'm into supernatural stuff, but more stuff that's unexplained rather than like sci-fi or actual monstrous stuff. So for me, this needed to feel like it was almost human. And so I wanted to, you know, tip the mouth up. I wanted to give it a vaginal vibe. I wanted it to be horrific in a kind of familiar way. So a lot of the imagery that I referenced with the designer of the prosthetic, who is Dan Martin, was kind of really disgusting medical imagery. So like, you know, tumorous images, fleshy things.
Absolutely.
That I wanted it to feel like it could be of Betsy rather than something that had taken over Betsy or was stuck on Betsy. So something, just like, you know, like we as humans are, you know, kind of naturally repulsed by the other. We, you know, if it looks different, we know it's not quite right. So if somebody is scarred, you know, it's like you can tell something's happened there, and that's what I wanted, was it for it to be a bit like ooh, but you kind of want to look at it, and that, so that was kind of the vibe. But yes, a lot of the notes when Dan's mock-ups and examples would come back would be like more like a vagina, even more like a vagina. So it was lovingly referenced as the vagina mouth on set.
Well, and the noises that it makes and the noises that everyone uses when they're eating in this movie are so very specific to now that you're saying that it was supposed to you know, have kind of a vagina like it. I mean, almost laborious noises when the baby is eating.
Exactly. I mean, that was very much an inspiration, as you know, as was labor for the process of, you know, Betsy's gestation of the idea, and the way she kind of physically behaves when she's really testing her mother at the end. But for me, you know, talking about the sound of eating food, like when we were kids, well, we got a row if you ate with your mouth open, but we get a row if we made what my mum called yummy noises. So like, you know, that kind of, and that's in there. That's still in there now. It's like if I know someone who makes a lot of noise when they eat, I'm a bit revolted by it, to be honest.
Yeah.
So that is a huge part of the sound design around the futakuchi.
When the thing I think that probably resonated the most for me at the very end, when Betsy delivers that last line to her mom, that her love made this possible, it's such a gut punch, because you don't know if she's saying it as an indictment or a thank you.
Yes.
I was very emotional watching that part. Were you intending to really draw out not just horror, but also that just guttural feeling that you feel as a parent or a child, and your feel for the loved one?
Big time. Yeah. I mean, I knew I wanted ideally my audience to cry. Like, you know, I mean, that's, all my work, you know, a lot of my work actually is, you know, has these horrific elements, has like the sort of psychological terrain there, but it also, what I hope, has a lot of heart and a lot of truth. And, you know, I get really excited if I can make people cry. I like being made to cry. I like melodrama. I like, you know, big emotions, swollen emotions. That's my thing. So I absolutely knew that I wanted you to kind of maybe not fall in love with this family, but really fall in real empathy with them. You know, I wanted you to go on the journey, not as a horror ride, but as a kind of, oh God, you know, the heartbreak of what happens to this family was more paramount to me than kind of the horror elements. And so, yeah, that, like, I get really emotional at the end still. And that was, yeah, those were for me the most challenging scenes to shoot, really, was kind of the bit on the bed, and then the bit that happens after the bed at the end of the film, like with right. Sienna. It was like I needed us to get to peak heartbreak with that. So to answer your question, yes. And you know, all you know, I kind of, if I'm not reading scripts and crying, or writing scripts and crying, you know, then I'm not, you know, not on the right track. I think,
absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I like that.
Wonderful. Well, I'm being told that was my last question, so I super appreciate it.
No,
and
thank you, Tracy.
Love your movie, and
thank
good luck
you.
to you.
Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate your words and getting to know you. Thank you.
No problem. Have a good rest of the day.
You too.